Okay, so I would first and foremost want to start off this webinar we've got. We've been looking forward to it for so long, hosted by the organization Undoing Tax Abuse, otherwise known as OUTA, as you can see. This webinar we are hosting today is on the topic of electoral reform. The question we are asking in this webinar is, why does it matter to the public? We have an expert panel with us today. We have in-house guests as well that have been engaging on this topic. And I've been thinking, up until now, it feels in 2022, it's electoral reform everywhere. Like it's suddenly something that has come up now on our radar, on our news posts, on our websites. And it's almost like we haven't received, as the public, enough information and education on what this means. So our panelists here today have been involved in this process for a very long time, and they will help us unpack this issue known as electoral reform and why does it matter to the public. So first of all, before we commence, I would like to introduce our panel. From my side, as your host today, my name is Rachel Fischer. I'm a representative of OUTA and monitoring what's going on from OUTA's side on electoral reform and conducting research on this matter. Part of our panelists today, I am very happy and excited to introduce you to Mudzuli Rakhivhane. Mudzuli is an LLB graduate from Stellenbosch University. She is an admitted attorney of law in the High Court and practiced as an attorney in dispute resolution, focusing on administrative law. One of her roles at One South Africa is advocacy, and part of that portfolio entails working on the electoral reform project, getting Parliament to pass a sensible and a fair bill, and for especially capacitating independent candidates, which is one of the elements why this speaks to electoral reform. Next, I would like to introduce Ibrahim Fakir, our second member of this panel. Ibrahim is the Director of Programs at the Oval Socio-Economic Research Institute, also shortly known as ASRI. He was awarded the Ruth First Fellowship for 2014 at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, where he read for the postgraduate degree in English literature and was elected to be on the SRC. Together with what he is doing in all his numerous projects, Ibrahim Fakir was a visiting fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in 2006, and a Draper Hill Summer Fellow at the Centre for Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford University in 2011. We've also been monitoring Ibrahim's engagement on a number of levels on electoral reform. For example, last year we had the Friedrich von Saal-Sabbert annual lecture that he presented on electoral reform, and we also see his columns quite regularly in the media on this matter. Thirdly, I would like to welcome our third panelist, Zarina Prasadh. Zarina is the director at the Africa School of Governance. She has over 20 years of experience in the legal sphere, having worked in both private and public sectors of society. Her expertise is far-reaching, and as we can see her here representing on electoral reform. Currently, Zarina runs her own legal consulting business. She holds various directorships as well as trusteeships. She is the director of the Africa School of Governance, whose primary focus is to train and raise up ethical and competent public leaders, as well as the director of the Independent Candidates Association. This ICA is a non-profit company that seeks to hold independent candidates accountable in public office. I would like to thank you, Mudzuli, Ibrahim, and Zarina, for being our guests today in this session and for the time that you've made available to us. Okay, so let us commence with this thing, unpacking electoral reform and all its complexities. Mudzuli, as I said in the beginning, we have encountered this electoral reform in a number of press releases going out, parliamentary engagement, provincial engagements, and it's at the forefront of what the public is seeing. But I'm not thoroughly convinced that the public is really aware of what it means. I mean, it's very heavy in legislation, it's very technical. So what does electoral reform mean to you?
Thank you. And I think your opening statement is so important about electoral reform can seem like such a dense subject. It's super technical. We're dealing with multiple types of different systems, and to get the public to understand constituency-based systems and first past the post and all of that can seem quite daunting for someone who doesn't engage with this on an everyday basis. I mean, I live and breathe this stuff, and I still need to sometimes sit and pull myself toward myself and be like, okay, this is this system and this is the implication of the system. And you know, we've got multiple people working on different aspects of this. So you've got issues of constitutionality, you've got issues of the technical details, you've got issues of systems, you've got issues of numerics. What does it actually mean to use a system, and then what are the numeric consequences of that? So I completely agree with you. It's a whole lot to digest. And so I think we need to draw back a little bit and ask ourselves, for the everyday South African, what does this mean for them and how does this change their lived experience? And I'd like to draw in on one particular aspect. And this is quite hard for me. I studied law, and I was fortunate to be at the Constitutional Court when the New Nation judgment was heard, when it was written, and when it was handed down. So it's easy for someone like me to sit down and really drill down on all the technical constitutional aspects and say, you know what, this really matters because of constitutionality, and it does. But if I were to remove my constitutional law hat and drill down on something that I think would really matter to people, the everyday South African who isn't a constitutional law expert, I would say that one thing about constitution, or rather electoral reform in the capacity that we're speaking about it today, is that it introduces new players into the system. So I'll use one aspect of independent electoral reform, which is independent candidacy. Now, again, to the public, sometimes it might feel like it's independent candidates for independent candidates' sake. Or to a constitutional expert, it might be, well, independent candidacy is very important because it gives expression to fundamental rights, such as the right to freely associate, or as the Constitutional Court mentioned, to disassociate. But I'd like to break it down this way, to say independent candidacy introduces into our electoral system the ability for a South African citizen who is maybe currently tied up in corporate South Africa, who is extremely well-versed in issues such as micro or macroeconomics, has incredible ideas on how to solve some of our issues, is an ethical leader, has a clean record, is extremely hardworking, dedicated, and has a passion for this country, and has a passion to help our country in specifically the area of, let's say, microeconomics. Now, for that person to, in the current system, in order for them to be impactful in terms of a government's position, that means, let's say as an MP, that means they've got to join a political party. They've got to make their way to the proverbial top through various structures, through various politics, through various factions. That seems like something a lot of people are not keen on doing. And so we need to think of how much talent are we actually missing out on in our parliament because of just the system through which talent has to go through in order to get there. And I think it's unfortunate that I can use examples as fresh as 24 hours ago, but I've seen so much discourse about, you know, this ethics committee in parliament and the fact that they found that William Kize, there's no harm, no foul, he can carry on. And so much of the response from the public to that has been, we need new people because the current people, the current system that the people hold is just completely untenable because it's going to be 2, 3, 4 election cycles where there's going to be absolutely no accountability for people, and in this instance, someone where people were at their absolute most vulnerable in the middle of a global pandemic. and money which should have been servicing our hospitals, getting people PPE, was stolen and wasted and squandered. And there's really nothing as the public that we can do about it, because we rely on a party political system to be our voice and to do that and to correct someone ethically or to hold someone ethically accountable. So this gives us an opportunity to get new blood into the system, new talent into the system that isn't bogged down by party politics, that isn't bogged down by factionalism, and that genuinely wants to serve the interest of the public without the other fluff.
Yes. Well, thank you for that and positioning it within this context, Mudzuli, because it does bring in new blood, new perspectives into the system without playing party politics or pandering to the political party. And like you say, there are so many steps to go to before you actually reach that point where you have a say, and much then of that integrity and ethical compass might, go off key. But won't it be just as difficult for an independent candidate to stand and to go through those hoops that we say political party individuals would have to go?
Oh, no. And well, I think there's two answers to that. It's yes and no, which is a terrible answer. But much of that actually is really dependent on the system that we choose, and how independent candidates will be able to gain a seat. And so I'll use an example through local government elections. So part of the work that One South Africa does is we used the local government election to demonstrate the desire for new blood and new talent in the system through what we call Section 15A organizations, which essentially, Rachel, you could start a homeowners association in your area, contest for a seat or councillor seat or mayoral seat in your municipality. You didn't have to be a registered political party. And that was one way that we used in order to sort of introduce the idea of independent candidacy at a local government election. But you can only do what the system allows you. So the conversation around systems actually goes hand in hand with this idea of electoral reform, because the success, and I don't want to use the word ease, like we're trying to make it easy for anyone to just stroll in and be a member of parliament. That's not the point. The objective here is to say, how do we create a system whereby on an equitable and a fair basis, we give independent candidates an opportunity to represent, in our example, constituency-based system. So it's a difficult thing to answer right now, because we unfortunately don't know what system Parliament is going to pick. Ideally, they pick a system whereby it's based on constituency-based systems, and the ease of that is that it's as direct as you could possibly get in an electoral system. In this group, one or two or three, depending on whether we choose a single system or a multi-system, to say, you will directly elect the person that you want to represent you in Parliament. And it's as simple as easy as that.
I like what you are saying there, Mudzuli, because I mean, if we want to make things easier, of course, with it comes its challenges. And, if people want to already contravene an already complicated system, how much more would they do so if the system were to be simplified? Speaking of systems and potential models as to which this could look like, I mean, in our panel, we've got Ibrahim Fakir, that was part of the panel that led to the Inclusive Society Institute's report on proposed electoral reform systems. So perhaps, Ibrahim, do you want to come in here now as to why you think electoral reform matters, and even in addressing what Mudzuli is saying with regards to systems?
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks, Rachel, and also Mudzuli for your input. For me, the electoral system is basic in the sense that it is the architecture and the process and the manner by which people in society are going to elect and confer power and authority on others to exercise and make decisions on their behalf. So you're giving power, you're giving authority for people to make decisions and to distribute resources. That's the long and short of what the electoral system is. Now, because this is a democratic this is a democratic governance system as envisaged by the Constitution, and it's a democratic set of practices that all of us want in society, the principle we should be guided by irrespective of how we configure the system, is to give the most fundamental amount of power and influence to the individual voter, to the individual citizen. And that's why the design of the system matters so much. So it's not a technical nicety. Of course, there are many technical aspects, as Mudzuli is pointing out, Rachel. There's so many complexities that you could bring in. But I think we must strip down the basics to their essentials, and the essentials should be, firstly, topmost, how much power and influence do we give to the individual voter themselves? So that's the first thing we must be guided by. The second is the system must be designed in such a way that it allows for the maximum amount of participation, because that's what democratic elections are about. The maximum amount of participation, our constitution covers that adequately, because everyone has a right to stand for office, everyone has a right to vote. But the way in which the system is designed would determine how representative the system is, how inclusive the system is, but also how diverse the system is. Now, the beauty of the current electoral system that we have for national and provincial elections is that it's very inclusive. No votes are wasted, so there's a lot of fairness. There's great amount of participation. But the question is that while we privilege those values, has it equally at simultaneously also privileged the values of the way in which institutions start to function in the system? Now, Mudzuli has pointed out two problems. One is that the manner in which individual voters can influence those who they've elected and selected to put into power is limited in the current system, despite its other advantages. Which means that because your individual influence over them as representatives is limited, your ability to influence their oversight agenda, their responsiveness agenda, and their accountability agenda is limited, because that is ultimately determined by the parties, because our system as it's currently configured is so party heavy, it's so party dependent, that it creates all the opportunities for influence for parties only and not for voters. So if we want to improve responsiveness and accountability and oversight, then changing the system while keeping its advantages around proportionality, around inclusivity, around diversity and fairness would be important considerations. Right? So I think if you take all those as the guiding values, it's clear to me over and above what the Constitutional Court has said in its judgment that there must be a change in the system to enable individuals to participate. There is a more thoroughgoing reason why we need change in the system, because the system at the moment is far too privileged and skewed towards empowering parties and doesn't empower voters as individuals sufficiently. And unfortunately, the current bill, which is before Parliament, is continuing this trend. It continues to empower parties at the expense of citizens, at the expense of individual voters. So in simple conclusion, Rachel, I think the reality is what's facing us now is we want to continue empowering parties by disempowering voters. And that's a major problem. Look, we must also be realistic that the electoral system is not something you willy-nilly change every time something doesn't work, right? Because that can prove to be far too destabilizing in society. But here we've got two imperatives. A, the current system has allowed parties to behave with complete and absolute impunity. Second is that because the parties have behaved with impunity, the institutions have become dysfunctional. And because the institutions are dysfunctional, trust of ordinary citizens in the democratic political system is incredibly low. Let me just leave you with one final thought. The Institute for Justice and Reconciliation did a survey, which was shortly before the 2011 local government elections. And one of the scariest findings was that 2/3 of people who were surveyed, and it's quite a robust method, the survey, so the results are actually quite robust. 2/3 of South Africans would be happy to reject any form of democratic government and democratic elections if a government would be able to provide basic services, jobs, and security. That's a scary thought, because people are not just prepared to do away with elections, they are also prepared to do away with restraints on the exercise of authority and power. And that's why I think the system needs to change, and needs to change in a way which is not what the current bill before Parliament envisages.
Thank you so much for that, Ibrahim. I mean, you've made it very clear, especially looking at the impunity of political parties that basically take over. It's their mandate. There's no way to stop them. And even if you look at the Political Party Funding Act, I mean, they do get allocated resources and finances, which immediately makes it more complex for independents to stand if they do not even have financial support, let alone support from voters. Based on what you've said, Ibrahim, I'm going to come to a question immediately from the audience that speaks to now for individuals standing. Because like you say, if this system now has to change, allowing for independent candidates and individuals to stand, we have a question here from Rolf Pretorius, and he asks about the concern whether the system will be flooded by persons wanting to stand as independents. So if a requirement is a list of signatures by registered voters, and that is to be accepted, how many of these voters must be approved to be candidates to eliminate chances, but also to differentiate with those that are serious voters to stand or serious candidates to stand?
That's a good question, Rachel. And there's often been arguments in the current system that the deposit is too high, the barrier to entry is too high. Now, of course, one doesn't want unnecessary barriers to entry, but at the same time, you have to weed out the kind of spoilers, the chances, and the people who are going to be completely opportunistic and who view this, particularly in our economic climate, which is all too rife anyway, as a job. So what would be the mechanisms for me? For me, the mechanisms is to find a realistic threshold of the number of signatures you will require to support your candidacy to participate as an individual. Number one, that's the first. The second would be, I think, the question of retaining a deposit. In the case of individuals, you can moderate the amount that is required, but remember that the deposit is always refundable, provided you reach a particular threshold of votes. So if you get, even if you don't win in a first past the post system, even if you don't win the election outright where you're competing with others, but unfortunately in the current bill, individuals are competing with parties, but let's leave that aside. I think the threshold of the number of signatures must be realistically set to weed out the chances and game players. And secondly, the deposit must be retained, moderated slightly lower for individuals to participate, but clearly not of such a magnitude that it becomes unaffordable. The reality is that the deposit is returned if you retain a modicum of support in an election. And in that case, I think that should be sufficient safeguards to ensure that we weed out the chances in the game players.
Thank you so much for that, Ibrahim. And Rolf, I hope that responds to your question. I see you have listed a few others, and we will get to them in due course. So Ibrahim mentions these complexities and how this legislature would be put up and the technicalities required for the minimum votes, the deposit requirements, and how that would technically look like on the ballot papers. I know that is another concern that arises if we already have such long ballot papers and voter rolls. How much longer will they become with independent candidates now also standing? So once again, these technicalities do become quite overwhelming. Zarina, with the Africa School of Governance, you did quite a bit to unpack these technicalities, especially from a legislative point of view. So what is your opinion regarding this?
Rachel, thank you. And again, thank you. As the Africa School of Governance, we very much feel like the new kid on the block, as it were, being 2.5 years old. But you know, thinking about your question, I'd like to tackle it really from a point of view of governance. We are a constitutional democracy, and South Africans should know that, and South Africans should, for all intents and purposes, guard that quite jealously. So I really want to look at 2 points when it comes to constitutional democracy, and those are that we are both a representative democracy as well as a participatory democracy. Now, when we look at these 2 questions, I guess the question that we need to be asking ourselves as South Africans is our constitutional democracy working? And these may not be the only 2 elements that factor in, but they are the 2 elements that I'd like to look at. So having regard to representative democracy, what does that mean? It means that as South Africans, we have chosen political parties to represent us in Parliament. The original 1994 elections, which spilled off then into the 1999 elections, the system of proportional representation was chosen. It made sense at the time, and constitutional democracy, as we know, is an evolving concept. So it obviously made perfect sense at that time, because what was necessary was unification of the state. It was never meant, however, to be a permanent system. It was always meant to be changed. 2003, we saw the electoral task team being appointed, and we all know the Van Zyl-Slabbert report and the recommendations that came from that report. Essentially, there was a recommendation that the proportional representation system would be changed to somewhat of a hybrid system, where a constituency-based system would be implemented. For all intents and purposes, that did not transpire, because 2003 was a year before the 2004 elections, and it just felt like it was an inopportune time to implement the recommendations. However, they were never implemented. 2017, fast forward at least 14 years later, and we get the high-level panel assessment by Kgalema Motlanthe, and again, the question gets raised, stating that electoral reform is necessary in some manner or form. Now, at that point, Kgalema Motlanthe and his task team raised the question of accountability, and it shows me how our constitutional democracy has evolved. Because in the Van Zyl-Slabbert report, the question of accountability was raised, but it wasn't as important an issue as it was in 2017, and possibly as it is right now, simply because in 2003, we were very much a young democracy, and there was still very much confidence in our representatives. Fast forward to 2020, the Constitutional Court renders the Electoral Act unconstitutional, to the extent that it does not allow individuals to run for elections. So let me pause on the representative issue, because I think for all intents and purposes, we need to ascertain whether or not there is confidence in our leaders. I think if we have regard to the floor crossing exercise of 2002, if we have regard to the 2 recalls of presidents, if we have regard to current office bearers who haven't recused themselves and or continue to take Parliament to court, if we have regard to the Zondo Commission, all of these point to the fact that South Africans have seemingly lost confidence in their representatives. So let me pause on that point. The second point I want to raise is we are in effect a participatory democracy. What does that mean? It means that as South Africans, we have the right to directly impact legislation that takes place or that gets passed. And how we do that is meant to happen through meaningful participation processes. Now, having regard to the current bill, what has transpired with regards to the process? Constitutional Court gave Parliament 24 months to fix this legislation, as it were. For almost 9 months, nothing transpired. The Ministerial Advisory Committee was only appointed in February last year, and I mean, that has followed its own process. But I just want to raise 2 points around this. 1st and 2nd of March, and then 7 to 23 of March, to 23 March, we see a kind of a public participation process happening. Was it a meaningful public participation process as defined? I don't think it was. I don't think that proper processes were followed, and I don't think that people were not properly educated. There was no proper information that went out. There was no proper notice for these hearings, etc. So I think if we have regard to these two elements, we may very well be failing our people. Now, should whatever amendments be that need to take place, should it take place through electoral reform? You know, there's this argument that changing our electoral system is not the panacea of accountability, and is certainly not going to fix all of our political problems. Of course, I accept that that's the case. It may not be the be all and end all, but what I do feel is it should happen now. I feel that it is very much a matter of, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? And if not through this piece of legislation, then how? And I just want to leave, my final point, Rachel, is just I want to leave us with this thought. A man is judged by the company he keeps. A company is judged by the men it keeps. And the people of democratic nations are judged by the type and caliber of officers they elect.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Zarina. I don't know if you have an opportunity at some point to even type that up and put it in the post. I think that would be an inspiration and quote going forward for us, you know, in our various campaigns as organizations we are leading. While I am also with you, Zarina, there are also a couple of questions that came through, part of the complexity of the individual candidature. Now, we have this one question from Overwatch 1 that asks, if independent candidates aren't part of a party, what would the process be if this independent candidate does pass away? And this is mirrored by Londiwe Mutabela's question that asks, what would happen if the independent candidate resigns from legislature or parliament? Will there be by-elections? So now we're putting up this fight for individual candidates to stand on an equal basis, which is one of the issues coming out with this current bill. But let's say now we do get our recommendations taken seriously by Parliament. Now they can stand, but then reality hits. I mean, an individual candidate is just one person. So even if they were to get multiple seats, how are those to be allocated? And then if they can't stand anymore, what would happen?
Thank you, Rachel. Really great questions. So I guess it really is going to come down to, like you say, what does the eventual act look like? And what will the current committee give consideration to in terms of some of the options that have been put forward? So let me begin with this question of what happens if something untoward happens to an individual, to an independent candidate that has already been elected. The way it currently stands is that that office stays vacant, which is something completely unheard of. I can't even fathom that South Africans will remain unrepresented in the political space. What should happen is there should be some kind of system in place, and one of the recommendations coming through is that there be some kind of by-election, or that there be some kind of second 2IC that can fill that position, as it were. There are jurisdictions that allows for, even in on ballot papers, where there be a first, second, third choice, as it were, for that particular seat or in the particular constituency. I think that was there was a second part to that question. Am I right?
Yes. So if they were to be resigned, or even if they pass away, so what could be done to replace them in this instance?
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, I think I've just answered that.
Yes.
But there was a second part to that, if I'm not mistaken. If I've missed it, please let me know.
Let me check for you. My apologies. Yes, it's the same. That was from Londiwe. If an independent candidate were to resign. I see Mudzuli's hand is up. Would you also like to attend to that, Mudzuli?
Yeah, I think I'll just add something to that. As Zarina had said, one of the proposals is that we follow what we do at municipal level. We run by-elections. That's for candidates who go in directly. That should they lose, should they pass away, should they resign, then that seat is filled. And I bring this up because I think there's also an important constitutional aspect to this. And our courts have in some ways already mentioned the importance of filling a seat. It's not just, again, filling a seat so that you always have 400 people. And I think it was the court in De Lille, when Patricia De Lille was in court on this, and the court specifically said it's so important for there to be some form of representation for our people in Parliament. And so I think sometimes we get caught up on the mechanism of it, and we actually forget about the principle that falls behind it, that it's not just a vacant seat and no one's getting a check for that, or there's just not going to be 399 people voting on something. It speaks to direct representation and the fact that there's a group of people who wanted a specific agenda represented in Parliament, who had a specific need represented in Parliament, who no longer have representation. And that's why, like Zarina, I feel like it's particularly an affront to that principle for the current bill to just say, we're not doing anything about it and we're leaving that seat vacant, because it flies in the face of representation, which is one of our key values in this country. And I know in one of my interactions with MPs on this topic, one of the issues that they brought up was, it's just too much of a logistical headache, or it's too expensive. And obviously, the obvious reason, or argument against that is, one, we run thousands of by-elections for councillors. So this is not a logistical issue. We do that already at local government elections seamlessly, really proactively, because again, we value the principle around representation. And secondly, you can't throw logistics and money as a solution or as a way to avoid accountability, as a way to avoid there being some sort of representation, especially if we're going to go on a constituency-based system. Imagine what it would look like if we were part of constituency X and we had one person. I'll use Rachel as an example. Rachel was our champion for the issue that we're dealing with in our community of a lack of access to water. She was the person we voted because she said, I have a plan. I'm going to go stand up for you. Whenever some issue comes up in Parliament about water, I will represent you directly on this basis. You know what my vote is going to be. You know what I'm going to champion for you. And Rachel passes away. And suddenly now as a community, we no longer have a voice. How does a logistical concern or a money concern stand in the way of that? So I think it seems like a silly thing to just throw away, but it's really important, especially based on the system that we end up choosing.
Thank you so much for that, Mudzuli. That, together with Zarina, gives us a very good overview, but also the complexity that we are facing, because figuring out the system, what it will look like, and if something were to happen, that we don't get caught off guard and then have delays stretching into weeks and months, and once again affecting essentially the public that needs to deal with the consequences of this happening. I have a couple of questions that I would actually like to ask our panel in this instance, or our guests, if you don't mind. We have a few guests in the back end that have also been dealing on this topic for a while, and I would like to get their input on this. Especially because this is now an event also hosted by OUTA. I would like to hand over to the CEO of OUTA, Wayne Divinage. And this comes with regards to civil society. The question we have is, why can't civil society call for a referendum to change the electoral system? The take is, if the electoral system is to change, the country needs to have a referendum, as Botswana has recently done. So our constitution has provision for this. So what do you see as civil society's role in this?
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks to our panelists. Very interesting discussion and a very necessary one. As regards referendums, there has to be a political appetite for that, and I think we've seen very clearly that our government doesn't have a political appetite to resolve matters of this nature through referendums. We wish they would. We could call for it, but we don't believe it's going to be accepted. What we are doing, though, is using the courts and placing as much pressure as we can on Parliament to move faster. As you can see, all the efforts and initiatives that have taken place. And I think some of the visitors have commented that very necessary in this space is education, voter education, and more so, we believe, schools, education in the schools. A lot of matriculants leave school at the voting age, and they are none the wiser as to their role and this hard-fought and hard-won democratic value of voting that exists, and the youth are missing in action at local and national elections. And if they just knew their power and understood, then they would get behind the need to vote and get behind the need for initiatives of this nature. So I think we've got to tackle this through greater education. We need to put pressure on the education system to introduce in the final years of schooling, the last 2 years, in the life sciences categories of education, what is voting mean? Why it's important? That's really what I would say. I know our time is limited, and civil society is extremely important in the pressures that we bring on multiple levels in this regard. But I'm afraid Parliament is dragging its feet, and we've got a lot of work to do.
Thank you so much for that, Wayne. And I'm so happy you brought up the whole notion of education. It has come up quite a bit in the comments section. And it's also the reason why we have this webinar, essentially. In monitoring Parliament and communications from government, we found that there was a lack in voter awareness campaigns, education campaigns, trying to make this more accessible, even informing the public in sufficient advance of the public hearings taking place. So even that was something that is missing. To help attend to this, the Organisation Undoing Tax Abuse is currently running a campaign. It is an electoral reform voter education campaign. We would like to get the public involved in these discourses, not just us presenting information, but also to hear from the public, especially what your feelings and impressions are. Now, this campaign will be shared in the chat. We are requesting the public, children from schools, to please submit drawings and illustrations. Why does voting matter? Why do elections matter? And it can be a simple pencil drawing or a crayon drawing, but we would like to collect these illustrations to form part of our future processes, events, webinars, and publications where we are trying to raise awareness. So please see the link. And if you have children, get them to engage. And if you have contact with schools, please reach out to them. I have another question for one of our guests, Dr. Michael Louis. If you don't mind responding to a question from Professor Mapunye. The question is, we must all ask and answer as South Africans, when is the most opportune or the best time to change an election system? And who can change it legitimately? Is it even possible to change the electoral system with the ANC's role in this, when it's clearly indicated a reluctance to change the electoral system for the past 28 odd years? Now, Michael, you've been involved quite a bit in civil society and the electoral reform process. What would be your response if you have 1 minute?
Sure, Rachel. Well, good afternoon to you, and thank you for this discussion. Well, needless to say, the time is now. It's long overdue, and I think all the pressures need to be there to put pressure on government. We do know that, and I think I loved what Wayne says, it's now been proven that the ANC haven't got the political will to do it. And I think with the big ANC conference that's happening in December to choose their leaders, they're not going to do anything about it until after that, because it really will choose which faction is going to be stronger. And so the time is now. You spoke about the transitional arrangements. We've got all the executive decisions that Zarina spoke about since 2003 from sale, all of them all along the last number of years. And so the time is now. So what I'd like to say, just in my minute, is that I don't believe this is going to be a political battle. I believe this is going to be won in the courts, but we have to put pressure on, because what was said previously, this is a power battle. This has got nothing to do with constitutionalism. This has got nothing to do about voting. This is about political power versus power to the people. And this is a systems, this is a battle of a system. So firstly, what Fakir said, I believe The people need to stand up. We need to educate what was said by Wayne, educate the public, educate the citizens of their power to effect change. I know it can be done. I know it's relevant. And then secondly, it's a systems change. This has got nothing to do, colleagues, about independent candidates. My walk the last 5 years on this journey, it's all about systems. Which system will change? And then there's that wonderful scientist that said, you can't change anything by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you need to make the old system totally obsolete to get an effect change. And that's what our pursuit must be. We need to stand together as civil society. We need to take back our power. We need to show government. We need to keep on pressurizing them. And my experience legally, and I really believe we're winning this, is we have to be ahead of the curve. And ahead of the curve legally, checking the governance issues, making them know that we are ahead of them, that we're checking them. And I promise you, you can write it on your forehead, we will win this battle. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I think, as you said, part of this process helps having that will. And I think we're all trying to be as vocal as we can to know we're putting pressure and to keep this momentum that has been built running, because we are viewing the deadline for June 2022 in the face. And then we also know we've got our next national elections in 2 years. So 2 years seem far off, but this is exactly the time in which we need to start forcing this. I have a final question for one of our guests, to Mr. Vali Musa. Mr. Musa, I know we've been having these conversations regarding accountability, ethics, and oversight. We have a question from the public, from Vuyo Zingula, that asks that electoral reform allows for independent candidates to contest elections. Given the corruption and fraud at Home Affairs and in any other potential public office, what can be done to protect the integrity of citizens and ensure accountability is kept and upheld for those members in office, such as ethics training, development, etc.? How do you see this?
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I found it extremely interesting. Some of the people I've heard speaking before, but it's always something new, that new angle that one gets. You must stop me, Rachel, if I'm going off track, but I want to make two preliminary remarks. The first is that in our endeavor to change and to improve the electoral system, a number of people have seemed to suggest, I'm not saying they say it, but could be interpreted to mean that one of our big problems is the existence of political parties. And we would be better off if Parliament was made up mostly of independent candidates and not mostly of political parties. Now, the point needs to be made in the kind of democracy which we have, which have many similarities to the democracy in the UK, in Germany, in India, in Malaysia, and also similarities to the United States, although they don't have a parliamentary system over there and such things. But in the kind of democracy that we have, and the kind of democracy, the only kind of democracy that we know really, the modern democracy, cannot function without the existence of viable political parties. I think I must make that very clear, because anybody who thinks that we're going to wish away political parties, that's just wishful thinking, really, because the whole system is premised on the existence of the political parties. So let me make that very clear. We need electoral reform and we need independent candidates and all of that, but our system is designed to function with political parties. And every other democratic system that I know of in the world is designed in exactly the same way. The second point I want to make is that a number of comments have been made about the ANC not wanting to change the electoral system and not want to allow for direct representation. Those are fair comments, and it's absolutely true. And of course, it is well known that I'm a member of the ANC, so let me declare that. But I think we mustn't lose sight of the battle that we have, we as citizens. And the battle we have is with every one of the political parties in parliament. They are all in the same boat in this one. And one of the reasons, one of the speakers has mentioned, I think Rachel, you have mentioned, what do we do to raise awareness, to mobilize people, and those sorts. One of the reasons for the media over the years not having reported sufficiently on this matter is because both the ruling party and the opposition parties do not want to allow for direct representation and have some sort of allergic response to the idea of independence. The ANC, the Democratic Party, and the EFF. And so I think that's important for us to know. So what do we do as citizens? We need to take head on the members of political parties, the political parties we are members of, the members of parliament that we know of, and we need to take all of them on board. And we need to, somebody needs to ask the EFF, why are you opposed to independent candidates? Because they are. And right now, they are all encouraging the ANC to take the approach that we do. I just thought I'll make that sort of point. On the question of ethics, I think it's a different point from the electoral system, because you can have unethical members of parliament who get to parliament by virtue of being on a party list, and you can get unethical members of parliament if they are independents. Being an independent in itself does not mean that the person would be ethical. But what it does mean is the person will have to be more responsive to the constituency he or she has been voted in from. And there's a higher likelihood that that person will think about what will the people who voted for me think about me when I go back the next time around. So I think that has an impact on the general behavior of the electorate represent, both ethical, but also doing the right thing in terms of making the right sort of laws, etc., etc. I'll stop there because you've given me limited time, Rachel.
Well, thank you so much for that, Mr. Musa. It's much appreciated. And I do like the balance you do bring to this discourse together with the reality that we are in. And I think essentially, if we do go forward in collaboration, at least, it should be a more balanced approach in these discourses. I would like to go back to our panelists. In your closing remarks, do you perhaps have one or two recommendations or considerations for the public to take away after this webinar? Ibrahim, I know that you stated very clearly the power must be with the individual. It's the right for every vote to count. How do we make those votes count for the public?
Sure. And when I say that the individual must count, I don't mean that the individual must count outside of or above the political party. What I mean is that every individual's vote must count importantly, but also each individual representative should have the ability to behave in parliament or in representative institutions on the basis of their own conscience. The trouble with the system where the parties are dominant and overweening is not that the parties are a problem. It's the problem. The problem is that the individual representatives are left without any conscience to exercise of their own. Had they had this, you may not have required the Zondo Commission. So I've heard many arguments which say that the system's not to blame. Well, the system is to blame because it's the system as currently configured that allowed the failure of oversight and responsiveness of Parliament to look over, irrespective of which issue you take, whether it's everything that's aired at the Zondo Commission, whether it's the landing of a private aeroplane at a military installation, whether it's the building of a house for a president. there literally has been a failure of the institution, and the institution failed because the individuals who populate that institution failed, and they failed to do so because they were hamstrung by their party. So there is a balance to be struck between giving maximum power to individual voters, but also to individual representatives, whether they belong to a party or not. That's the first thing. The second is that, the way in which the current bill that is drafted exists before Parliament has four problems, primary problems. And if we want to privilege the opportunity for individuals to exercise their vote, their discretion, their voice, their choice, then the compensatory proportional system must be done away with. That means that, in the current bill, what they envisage is that individuals will stand, but they will stand in each of the 9 provinces only. And that every voter will only vote once. They will vote for whoever they choose. The formula is described in the legislation for how the seats are calculated, but the individual voter is not given the chance to split their vote. So that's the second thing I would want people to go away with regard to what's before Parliament at the moment, is that insufficient and problematic as the current draft is, that problem is compounded by the fact that it's a compensatory PR list, not a separate list which allows a voter to choose their candidate or their party, even for that matter, as different from the one where they chose on the main ballot. So I think that's the problem. The third is, the current draft empowers parties and disempowers voters, disempowers citizens. That's not to argue that we must do away with parties or parties are problems. To say, no, they can have it, but give the power of the vote, of voice and of choice to actual voters. And lastly, the main issue for me is that, there's this fetishization of proportionality and inclusivity. And yes, we must be inclusive. The Constitution is very clear about multi-party democracy, but the Constitution is very clear in the founding principles that multi-party democracy is not a value and a virtue of itself. It is a virtue to other values. And those other values, as stated in the founding provisions, are to ensure responsive and accountable government. And because we're lacking that, the nature of system design must be attuned to provide greater accountability, greater oversight, greater responsiveness. And for me, that's the problem with the current bill, is that it doesn't allow for any of these things and takes away all the influence and power that an individual voter should enjoy.
Thank you so much for that, Ibrahim, especially with accountability, responsibility, and oversight, responsiveness, and accountability. And we are still getting in questions. So I think if the panelists don't mind, we can continue sharing with these and use this to inspire our next events and engagements. Zarina, from your side, do you have a couple of takeaways for the public?
Thank you, Rachel. I think that if one has regard to the current bill and how it's drafted, if I were to look, obviously there are a number of problems with it, number of difficulties with it, but if I were to take one aspect of it that I think is almost unconscionable, that is the fact of, or it's the element of wasted votes. And surplus seats. So essentially, let's assume that I decide to run and I need 80,000 votes for a seat, and I get 100,000 votes. 20,000 of those votes will effectively be discarded, as it were. Now, that for me is a very, very sad day in our country's history, given our history and what South Africa has gone through in order to get to where we are. So, the premise is one person, one vote of equal value. And so that will be lost. And so I think that really is, for me, probably the saddest of all. So yeah, I just want to leave us with that. But I think just generally as the public, active citizenry become more and more involved, I think that this is one piece of legislation, unfortunately, where we are going to see political parties stick together. I think that's my personal view. I think that it affects all of them to some extent. And so unfortunately, it has become and may become an us versus them situation. So we are looking to the public to become more active in our politics, in our democracy, and it's going to require active monitoring and evaluation by us as the public. So Rachel, I want to leave you with one final quote. You know, I love my quotes.
Yes, thank you.
I have one from Benjamin Franklin. He says, when Benjamin Franklin was asked after a session of the Constitutional Convention, what kind of a government have you given us? He replied, a democracy, if you can keep it. Our republic is founded on the principle that it will continue only as long as the people keep democracy alive. Each citizen who participates in community affairs is keeping democracy alive. Every act of mercy and helpfulness, every word spoken for freedom keeps the democratic spirit alive. Democracy is maintained by passing it on from one generation to another, in the school, in places of worship, and in the home. At every stage, it must be strengthened. Let us therefore resolve to give to our successors a stronger republic than what was passed on to us. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much for that, Zarina. And if you have time to type it while Mudzuli closes off, we very much appreciate your quotes as well. Mudzuli, your final takeaways.
Sure. So I think on the technical aspects of the bill, Zarina and Ibrahim have covered those quite extensively. I would just add one small point, and that's to look for the public to look out for what they decide to do on the fee that independent candidates would have to pay in order to participate. From the public participation process, it seems very evident that at least the ANC and actually other political parties are pushing for independent candidates to pay the same fee that political parties pay, which you can imagine is one quite high. And it seems to me that this is one way that they're using regulations to kind of like exclude independent candidates from participating, which you can see as an obvious flaw. Political parties, which have been in existence for decades, are heavily funded. They've got huge machines behind them. And it would be a sad day for me to think that people, especially categories of people in this country, have been previously left out of the economy, that they would be left out of participating simply because of a fee which isn't determined on an equitable basis. But secondly, the current regulation as it is, say there's absolutely no exception. So no matter how good of a candidate you are, regardless of how much support you may garner from your community, and regardless of your own circumstances, there's no provision currently that gives any exception to the fee to be paid. So I would keep a look on that and see what number they actually decide on. But I imagine that that will be met with a number of legal challenges from individuals and civic societies. And then outside that, I think my parting shot to the public would be that there's two opportunities for us to participate here. One, we've seen the number of voters be just on a steady decline over our last few elections nationally and locally. And what I'm hoping, if we do get some sort of holistic reform in our electoral system, my hope is that this will re-enfranchise people to participate at the ballot again, through what I discussed in the beginning, that there being fresh talent and new blood to vote for, and also that the system will enhance the value of directness and accountability. So I hope that the public sees this as a fresh start and a second dawn, if you would. And then the second part of participation that we have an opportunity to engage in here is that there's a wealth of people in this country who are skilled, talented, honest, hardworking, have amazing solutions for this country. And this is an opportunity, I believe, for those people to now take this opportunity to rise up and become active participants in the system. You know, I think South Africans have almost been giving the luxury of an excuse that it's too hard, it's too difficult, it's too dirty. I don't want to be in the mud with the political parties anymore, which is fine. But now there's an opportunity for those people to step up to the plate. And my hope out of this is that we see a new group of people come into the system and show us what they've got. And let's test this out and see how, like I think Michael and the two other people had said this, no one would ever purport this to be the silver bullet to solving all the problems, but it certainly is an opportunity to shake up a system which clearly is not working anymore.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Mudzuli. And the opportunity is now, isn't it? We are being faced by the reality of the Electoral Reform Bill B1 2022 that has the Concord deadline of 10 June 2022. We don't know whether a deadline is going to be amended, but if we work with the assumption that Parliament will seek to pass it, we know it's going to have implications in the next 2 years. Our time has run out for this takeaway. I hope as the public you've managed to get your takeaways over lunch. If you're heading back to the office, that you have some key points to discuss with colleagues, friends, and family. Please look again at the chat, at the campaign. We do ask you to engage with the campaign. Get your children, colleagues, and friends. Once again, it can be crayons, it can be illustrations. Also know that this recording will be made available so you could watch it later. You know where to find us. OUTA's contact details are on the website. If you wish to engage with us further on this topic, please reach out. We also like to keep company with our excellent guests, our panelists, and our colleagues. Thanks to each of you for making your time available, not only your time, but also your expertise and your willingness to collaborate on this. I think being proudly South African, I would say for this webinar, all potholes have been observed instead of protocol. And I wish to see you all soon on other platforms for this continuous engagement. Thank you.